My name is Josephine Hale. I am 33 years old, and the day my mother called me sweetheart for the first time in my adult life was the same day a business publication ran a profile on the company I had built from a single spreadsheet in a studio apartment in Cincinnati. She had not called me sweetheart when I was 12, and she shipped me to live with my father's aunt in rural Kentucky because I had apparently become too complicated for the version of family she was trying to construct. She had not called me sweetheart at my college graduation, which she did not attend, or at my sister's wedding, where I had been assigned a seat at the back table with people I had never met. She had not called me sweetheart in any of the 4 years between my last attempt at maintaining contact and the morning her name appeared on my phone screen like a test I had not studied for, but the profile had gone live 12 hours earlier. And suddenly I was, sweetheart. I almost let it go to voicemail. I had 22 unread messages, a contract review pending, and a coffee that had been getting cold on my desk for 40 minutes. But something in me, the part that had spent 20 years waiting for a version of my mother that was never going to arrive, picked up, and her voice came through the speaker, warm and unfamiliar, asking how I was, saying she had seen the article, saying she was so proud, saying that she had been thinking about family a great deal lately and that there was something important she wanted to discuss. Something that could not wait. Something that would mean a great deal to both of us if I would just come and hear her out. I said I would think about it. She said wonderful, and that she would have the guest room made up. I did not go that week. I sat with the phone call for several days and felt the old familiar pull of it, that particular gravity that daughters raised on intermittent affection know by texture before they know it by name. The hope that this time the warmth is real. The fear that doubting it makes you the cold one. The exhaustion of having the same internal argument for 20 years without resolution. Then a woman named Miriam Cross, who had been my father's aunt and the person who had raised me from age 12 in a farmhouse outside Harrodsburg, Kentucky, came to mind. Not because she was alive to give advice. Miriam had died 2 years earlier, quietly, and with the particular completeness of people who have made peace with every room in their life. She came to mind because of what she had told me the last time I sat across from her at her kitchen table, 1 week before she entered the hospital for the last time. She had held my hand and looked at me with the directness she had always used, the kind that did not bother with cushioning, and she said, "Your mother loves an audience more than she loves a person. Remember that when she comes back wearing kindness." I remembered it. I drove to Cincinnati. I did not go to my mother's house. I went to the office of a woman named Patricia Oakes, who was the attorney I had used to structure my company's first investor agreements and who had become, over 4 years of working together, the kind of counsel you trust with the things that are harder to explain than contracts. I told Patricia about the phone call. I told her about the article. I told her about the 20-year gap and what had filled it and what had not. Patricia listened the way good attorneys listen, with a quality of attention that never rushes the person talking because they understand that the details that feel like background are often the structure. When I finished, she asked me one question. She asked whether my mother had mentioned anything specific about what she wanted to discuss. I said she had said it was about something that would mean a great deal to both of us. Patricia wrote that down. Then she said, "Go hear what she wants. Take nothing with you in writing. Promise nothing. And call me the moment you leave." I drove to my mother's house on a Thursday afternoon in early October. The house was in a suburb north of Columbus, the kind of neighborhood designed to communicate stability at a glance. Maintained lawns and matching mailboxes and the particular silence of streets where everyone works the same hours. My mother, Vivian Hale, had lived there for 11 years with my stepfather, Roland, who was an affable man with good manners and a habit of leaving rooms when conversations got specific. I had met him for times. My mother opened the door before I reached the porch. She was dressed in the way she dressed for occasions she considered important: cashmere, good earrings, hair done. She pulled me into a hug that lasted a beat too long and smelled like the perfume she had always worn. The one that was supposed to signal warmth, but had always, to me, smelled like performance. Inside the house was a small gathering I had not expected. My sister Renata was there, seated on the sofa with the careful expression of someone who has been briefed on a situation and is hoping it resolves without her involvement. Renata and I had never been enemies, but we had never been close in the way sisters can be when they share a childhood instead of dividing it. She had stayed. I had been sent away. We had both grown up knowing that fact and deciding, separately, never to discuss it directly. Renata's husband, Marcus, nodded at me from across the room with the polite remove of a man attending someone else's family business. My stepfather, Roland, appeared from the kitchen with drinks and the relieved expression of a man whose job in this room was to be pleasant and nothing else. My mother guided me to a chair with her hand on my back, which was 3 more touches than she had offered in the last decade combined. Then she sat down, set her hands in her lap, and told me what she wanted. She said she had been in conversations with a family friend, a woman named Claudette Marsh, who had been running a nonprofit focused on workforce development for women in rural communities. She said Claudette was expanding the organization and had brought my mother in as a strategic advisor, which my mother described with the confident brevity of someone who had decided not to invite follow-up questions about her qualifications. She said the organization was launching a major fundraising initiative and that my mother had suggested my company as a potential founding sponsor. She said my name, my platform, and my story, the daughter who built something from nothing, would be enormously valuable to the campaign. She said it would be meaningful. She said it would be legacy. She said the founding sponsorship level was $400,000 and that she had already told Claudette to expect a commitment. She paused there. The way people pause when they have delivered the number and want you to absorb it before their persuasion resumes. I looked at her. I looked at Renata, who was looking at her hands. I looked at Roland, who was looking at the window. Then I looked back at my mother and I said I would need to review everything before I could discuss commitment. My mother nodded in the warm, patient way of someone who believes the answer has already been decided, and this is simply the formality before it becomes official. She said, of course, that Claudette would send materials, that she was so glad I had come, that she had always believed I would do something remarkable, that she had known it even when I was young. That last sentence landed somewhere specific. Even when I was young. I let it sit. I said nothing in response. I finished my drink, made the appropriate noises about keeping in touch, and drove out of that neighborhood with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind moving very fast through a set of calculations I had been building my entire company around. The materials from Claudette Marsh arrived the next morning. I forwarded them to Patricia before I opened them fully, then sat down and read them the way I read any document whose purpose I do not yet trust completely. The organization was called the Forward Ground Initiative, registered as a 501c3 in Ohio. 2 years old, modest publicly disclosed programming. A board composition that was heavy on names I did not recognize and light on people with visible track records in workforce development. The initiative my mother had described was called the Founding Voices Campaign. The materials were polished, the kind of polish that costs money to produce, with professional photography and mission language that hit every emotional note in the right order. The founding sponsorship level was listed at $450,000, not $400,000, as my mother had said. That discrepancy was small enough to be explained as imprecision, and specific enough to be a flag. I noted it. The listed benefits of founding sponsorship included prominent naming rights on programming materials, an advisory board seat, speaking opportunities at the annual convening, and what the materials described as an integrated brand partnership with campaign communications. I read that phrase twice. Integrated brand partnership meant my company's name and reputation would be woven into Claudette Marsh's campaign materials before anyone had verified what the campaign actually produced. I called Patricia. She had already started reading the documents on her end. She asked me to give her 48 hours. I told her to take 72. What Patricia found in 72 hours was the beginning of a picture that got worse the more carefully it was drawn. The Forward Ground Initiative had been incorporated 2 years earlier, with Claudette Marsh as executive director and 3 board members, one of whom was listed as a strategic advisor with an address that matched a property my mother and Roland co-owned in a resort community in South Carolina. The organization had filed one annual report with the state, showing modest programming expenditures and a significant allocation toward administrative and consulting costs. The consulting costs were paid to vendors. One had a clean but limited track record. The other was a communications firm for employees and a client list that did not include a single other nonprofit. The communications firm's registration address was 2 blocks from my mother's house. I asked Patricia what she thought. She said she thought I should talk to an investigator before I decided how far to go. She gave me a name, a man named Daniel Witt who worked out of Columbus and whose practice focused on financial and nonprofit fraud. I called him that afternoon. Daniel was the kind of person who communicated in questions rather than conclusions. The professional habit of someone who has learned that the person who reaches the answer themselves is more useful in a complicated situation than the person who was told. He asked about my mother's history with charitable work, which, as far as I knew, was limited to occasional committee involvement at her church. He asked about Claudette Marsh's background, which on public record showed a career in event management and corporate hospitality before the nonprofit registration. He asked about the timeline of when my mother had become involved with the organization relative to when the Founding Voices campaign had been developed. I did not know the answer. He said that would be worth finding out. He called me back 6 days later, and what he had found changed the shape of everything. The Forward Ground initiative had been restructured 8 months earlier, coinciding with the addition of my mother to what appeared in internal board minutes as a strategic partnerships role, a role that was not listed on the public-facing materials. The Founding Voices campaign had been conceived and developed during those same 8 months. The campaign materials, including the polished deck sent to me, had been produced by the communications firm near my mother's house. The total spent on campaign development before a single dollar had been raised from any sponsor was $230,000, drawn from the organization's operating reserves, which had been built over 2 years from a series of small individual donations and 2 mid-size grants, $230,000 on materials and communications, for a campaign that had not yet secured a single founding sponsor. And the first person my mother had approached for the founding sponsorship was me, using a family occasion as the delivery mechanism. Daniel also found something else. The executive director's salary for Claudette Marsh had been increased in the same restructuring period, from a modest nonprofit rate to one that was difficult to justify against the organization's current size and output. My mother's strategic partnerships role was unpaid on paper, but there was a consulting agreement between my mother's name, operating under a personal LLC she had registered in Roland's name the previous year, and the communications firm that had produced the campaign materials. The consulting fee on that agreement was substantial. The work performed under it was described in language vague enough to survive only the most incurious examination. My mother was not receiving a salary from the nonprofit. She was receiving payments from the vendor. The nonprofit was paying from funds that included donor money, grant money, and now the founding sponsorship she had come to me to secure. I sat with that information for a full day before I decided what to do with it. I want to be honest about what that day felt like, because I think the honest version matters more than the cleaned up one. I felt grief first. Not surprise grief, which is what happens when you receive confirmation of something you had hoped would turn out to be smaller than your instincts told you it was. I had not come to Ohio believing my mother had changed. I had come, somewhere underneath the professional caution, with the residual hope that the call had been partly real. That sweetheart had contained at least a splinter of actual feeling, even if it had been activated by convenience. Finding out it had been entirely transactional removed that splinter. What was left underneath was cleaner, but colder. Then I thought about the $450,000. About my company's name on campaign materials for an organization structured to route money through a consulting arrangement back to my mother, before the first woman in a rural community had received a single hour of workforce development. About what it would have meant for my investors, my clients, my team, my reputation, to be publicly associated with that. About how neatly the whole thing had been packaged. The family reunion, the warm house, the cashmere and the perfume, Renata on the sofa as ambient witness, Roland with the drinks. All of it set dressed to make the number feel like a natural conclusion to a homecoming rather than the destination of a deliberate extraction. I thought about Miriam Cross, about her kitchen table, and the directness of her last words to me. Your mother loves an audience more than she loves a person. She had been building toward an audience of donors and partners who would see my name on the founding materials and assume the legitimacy of my association. She had planned to use my professional reputation the same way she had used my father's name when she needed a family that photographed well. And then, when it became complicated, the same way she had removed me from the picture. I called Patricia. I told her I was ready to make a decision. She asked what I wanted. I told her I wanted two things. I wanted the Forward Ground Initiative to be unable to use my name or my company's name in any context, now or in the future, in association with this campaign or any other. And I wanted the financial arrangement between my mother's consulting LLC and the communications firm referred to the Ohio Attorney General's Charitable Trust Section, which is the state body responsible for investigating nonprofit financial misconduct. Patricia said she could do both. She said the second one would be consequential. I said I understood. There was a pause on the line. Patricia said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. She said she would need to brief additional counsel on the nonprofit side. I said to proceed. I sent my mother one message before anything was filed. Not a confrontation, not an accusation, not the kind of thing designed to produce a scene. A single paragraph. I said I had reviewed the Forward Ground Initiative materials and related financial documentation. I said I would not be providing any funding, naming rights, or brand association. I said my attorneys would be in contact regarding trademark protection. I said I wished her well. She called within 7 minutes. Her voice had changed. The softness was gone, replaced by something tighter and more familiar, the tone she had always used when she felt her control of a situation slipping. She said I had misunderstood everything. She said I was being paranoid. She said this was exactly why family relationships were difficult, because I always looked for the worst interpretation. She said Claudette was going to be devastated. She said I was going to look ungrateful. I let her finish. Then I said two things. I said I had not misunderstood anything, and that the documentation was thorough enough to demonstrate that. And I said that the last time she had accused me of making things difficult, I was 12 years old and being asked to make myself smaller so her version of family had room to work. I told her I was no longer 12. Then I ended the call. The state referral was filed the following week. Patricia worked with a nonprofit regulatory attorney named Howard Gill, who had spent 15 years on the charitable trust side before entering private practice, and who described the financial structure of the Forward Ground Initiative on first review as one of the more elegantly constructed misappropriation vehicles he had encountered in a regional nonprofit context. That was not a compliment. The investigation that followed was not fast. These things rarely are, but it was methodical, and methodical was all I needed it to be. While it proceeded, I watched what my mother had not anticipated. The Forward Ground Initiative's major grant funders received notification from the Attorney General's office that an investigation was ongoing, which triggered standard review clauses in 2 of those grant agreements. One funder put the relationship on administrative hold. Another requested a full financial audit before any further disbursements. Claudette Marsh, whose name was the official one on every document, even though the operational architecture had been largely designed around my mother's involvement, hired her own attorney. That attorney, in the course of advising his client, made several disclosures that accelerated the investigation considerably. The communications firm near my mother's house was examined. The consulting agreement between that firm and my mother's LLC was examined. The nature of the work supposedly performed under that agreement was examined and found to be insufficiently documented to justify the payments made. Claudette cooperated in exchange for a reduced personal liability finding. My mother did not cooperate, which is a decision that people in her position consistently make and consistently regret. By the time the investigation concluded, the findings included improper personal benefit from charitable assets, inadequate documentation of consultant arrangements, misleading representations to the board about the nature of strategic partnership activities, and the use of a related party vendor relationship that had not been disclosed as required. The monetary penalties applied to the organization were significant. The personal findings against my mother resulted in a permanent bar from serving in any officer, director, or management role in any Ohio-registered nonprofit. The bar was public record. Claudette Marsh received a reduced finding and restitution obligations. She also gave an interview to a nonprofit governance publication about what she described as the risks of allowing strategic advisors to operate with board-level influence without formal governance accountability. She did not name my mother directly in the interview. She did not have to. The investigation record was public. I did not go back to Columbus during any of this. I followed the proceedings through Patricia and Howard and the occasional document summary that appeared in public filings. I had no interest in watching the process as spectacle. The investigation was not designed to produce a moment I could witness. It was designed to produce an accurate public record of what had happened. That was what I had wanted. That was what I received. What I had not anticipated. And what I sat with for a long time after the investigation concluded was Renata. She called me 4 months after I had sent my mother the single paragraph message. Her voice was careful, in the way of someone who has been rehearsing the call and is still not sure how it will land. She said she had not known the full structure of what was happening with the foundation. She said she had known there was a meeting about funding, but had believed my mother's description of it as a straightforward charitable opportunity. She said when the investigation became public, she had gone back and asked my mother to explain, and that the explanation had been unsatisfying in ways she was still working through. I let her talk. She said several more things, some of them about the years we had not been close, and some of them about the specific shape of a family that had protected its image by assigning certain roles to certain people and discouraging any examination of how those roles had been assigned. She did not use clinical language for any of this, just the careful, hesitant language of someone who has arrived at an understanding they would have preferred to arrive at earlier, and is honest enough to say so. I asked her one question. I asked whether she had known, when we were children, that the reason I had been sent to live with Miriam was not what our mother had described. Our mother's version had always been that I had struggled with the family environment, that it had been mutually agreed, that it was in my best interest. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had not known the full version when we were children. She said that as an adult she had had questions she had never asked because asking them required examining things she did not want to examine. She said the investigation had made not examining them feel less like caution and more like complicity. That answer was honest enough that I stayed on the phone. We talked for an hour. It was the longest conversation Renata and I had ever had that did not involve logistics or obligation. At the end of it, she asked if we could talk again sometime. I said yes, and meant it, carefully and without expectation. The way you mean things when you are building something new from material that came from a difficult place. My mother wrote me a letter 6 months after the investigation closed. She sent it to my company address, which told me she did not have my home address, which I had not offered her, which was itself a form of information. The letter was 2 pages. It covered the investigation in language that positioned the findings as an overreach and a misunderstanding. It covered our relationship in language that positioned my distance as a wound she had tried repeatedly to heal. It covered the phone call and the visit and the proposal in language that made the sequence sound like an act of genuine family reconnection that had been complicated by my misreading. What it did not contain was an acknowledgement of what the consulting arrangement had actually been. What it did not contain was a sentence that said, "I tried to use your reputation as collateral for a financial structure that benefited me." What it did not contain was any indication that she understood the difference between those 2 versions of events. I read the letter once. I did not keep it. I was not sure what the right response was for a long time, and then I decided there was not one. That some letters are not requests for dialogue, and responding to them as though they were would only produce more letters. I filed it in the same mental category as the graduation I had walked through alone, and the wedding table at the back of the room. Proof of a pattern that had been consistent enough over 30 years that adding to the documentation was unnecessary. What I did do, in the months after the investigation concluded, was something that had been forming in me since the morning I received Daniel Witt's second report and sat alone with the information for a full day. I incorporated a small grant-making program under my company's charitable arm. The program awards 1 annual grant to an individual woman who has built a business or professional practice in a rural or underserved community without institutional support. The selection criteria are specific. No family capital. No professional networks from higher income upbringings. No academic institutions in her corner. Just the work, the decisions, and the results. All built without the safety nets that people who have them tend to underestimate. I named the program the Miriam Cross Award. The first recipient was a woman in Eastern Tennessee who had built a veterinary practice serving farming communities within a 50-mile radius that had no large animal vet for over a decade. She drove 2 hours to Columbus to receive the award. She wore good shoes and shook my hand with the firmness of someone who has spent years lifting things that required both arms. After the ceremony, she told me that the hardest part of building without support was not the money. It was the recurring absence of anyone who had seen what you were doing and decided it was worth acknowledging before it became impossible to ignore. I told her I understood that from a particular angle. She looked at me in the way of someone who recognizes a sentence that holds more than it is saying and decides not to require the rest of it. We have stayed in touch. I still live in Cincinnati. My company is smaller than the coverage made it sound, but more stable than the coverage suggested was possible. I have 3 people I call without editing myself first. I have a garden on my roof that produces tomatoes in summer that are better than anything I have purchased from a store. I have Miriam's cast iron skillet, which she left to me specifically in her will, with a note that said she trusted me to season it correctly, which was both practical instruction and the most affectionate thing anyone has ever said to me about my competence in a kitchen. The day my mother called me sweetheart was the day I understood, finally, and without remaining ambiguity, that the word had never described how she felt about me. It described what she needed from me in that particular moment. It was a function word, not a feeling word. And the person who taught me the difference between those 2 categories, who demonstrated it daily for 20 years in a farmhouse kitchen in Harrodsburg, was not the woman who had used my name on a sponsorship document without asking. She was the woman who had sat through every choir concert, packed every lunch, and held my hand at her kitchen table one last time, and told me precisely what I needed to know in the plainest language available to her. I was not sent away because I was difficult. I was not excluded because I was not enough. I was removed because I was accurate. And accuracy in families organized around performance is the most inconvenient thing a child can possess. The most honest thing I ever did was stop trying to be convenient enough for my mother to want me back. And the second most honest thing was picking up the phone when Daniel Witt called with his second report and saying, "Tell me everything."